Good evening and welcome to Gender Trailblazers, presented by Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras in partnership with Amnesty International Australia and the Carmen Rupe Memorial Trust. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy an evening of incredible conversation, interspersed with wonderful performances as we celebrate the remarkable lives of three transgender trailblazers who truly embody the courage of the human spirit.
There's so many people that helped me get here, and I just want to say thank you to Focus Features, to Mick Sullivan, to Jim Toth, to Jason Weinberg, to Emma Ludbrick, to Callie Addams, to the entire Dallas Buyers Club team. Matthew, I love you. Jean-Marc, and this is for the 36 million people who have lost the battle to AIDS, and to those of you out there who have ever felt injustice because of who you are or who you love, tonight I stand here in front of the world with you and for you. Thank you so much.
Now, we saw there that Jared got the Oscar for his performance as Rayon in the Dallas Buyers Club. So how was it working with Jared in that role?
I've been really lucky in that I've been able to work with the sort of creme de la creme of Hollywood stars, and at that level, you know, they're artists. They're actually brilliantly gifted people. We see the tabloids and it's like, oh, plastic surgery, money, relationships, but it's easy to lose sight of the fact that they are actually genius level artists as well. And Jared came to me, and it was a role in the 1980s of a trans woman who had no money, no access to surgical interventions, of which I've taken generous advantage. You know, little access to hormones, to counseling, to makeup and wigs or anything. And then who was, you know, living with HIV, who was living with addiction. This was a very complicated role of its time and of its moment. And Jared was very open. He made some huge missteps in his early speeches when the awards circuit was happening. But when the Academy Awards came around, he had been course corrected, and I think it really sank in for him what that role could possibly mean to educating people.
As you say that, I think about the number of times we've got somebody who's kind of, in a way, brand new to the whole idea, and over time we see that penny drop. And it makes me wonder, how do we get that penny to drop, you know, across the community, socially, locally, media, politics. Anyway, that's a whole nother big thing. So part of the controversy there was it was deemed that a transgender person ought to have been playing that role. So what is your opinion of the casting, in the sense that the role was not being played by someone in the trans community?
Well, 12 years ago, I moved to Hollywood and started a production company called Deep Self Productions with Andrea James. And the entire idea behind it was to increase opportunities for trans people in the media and to improve representation. What a lot of young and new people who are very passionate, you know, maybe don't realize is just that it has been, you know, in my mind, steps to a goal. And what the work that I've done in decades past now, you know, was of its time and of its moment. I think the roles that I've consulted on were going to happen whether I worked with the actor or not. You know, the vast sums of money were in play. A lot of factors were in play, and I felt like I could at least step in and ameliorate the damage that might be done should they just go off the rails with it. thanks to, I think, some of the things I've worked on, many of the things that many other people have worked on, we're just now hitting a point in Hollywood. The doors have been opened, the minds and the eyes have been opened, and now we have Laverne Cox, we have Alexander Billings in Transparent, we have Harmony Santana. A lot of doors are opening, and I'm very thankful that those imperfect steps could have been taken so that now finally trans people are getting our opportunity.
And getting the visibility
Yes.
to normalize. Yeah. Felicity Huffman was also nominated for an Oscar for her role in Trans America, and she said that at the time she was completely ignorant about the issues that trans individuals face. I think we had a picture there, but I'm not sure if that's going to come up. How different was it working with Felicity compared to Lee and Jared?
I was actually very excited to have a woman playing a trans woman in a film. I would have been most excited to have a trans woman play a trans woman in a film. But I felt like, it was one step closer because I identify as a woman. If it's educationally or politically valuable, I will discuss my history of transition as I'm doing now, but I identify as a woman, so I loved seeing a woman play this role. She had a lot of questions though, and we talked about a lot of things, and she absorbed it all like a sponge. She's remained a friend and a friend to the trans community. I was very grateful for that experience.
Oh, that's lovely. I remember when we talked on the phone the other week, you mentioned a sense of, and you just mentioned earlier, a sense of damage control in your work as a consultant. Were there particular myths and stereotypes that you were aiming to counteract or that you faced in these consulting roles?
People outside the trans community, they often feel like it's a monolithic community, that everyone has the same starting point, the same process, and the same goals. And I try to really hammer home that people start from so many different places. They have so many different processes, and they have incredibly different goals as well. That not everyone is binary, not everyone is heteronormative, that gender identity and sexuality are separate. And I'm sort of an easy entree into the conversation for a lot of people because I am fairly heteronormative, I'm fairly binary, sorry, but I do educate. Sometimes people are like, oh, Calpurnia, you're just perpetuating those things, but I educate, I advocate that, not everyone is heteronormative, not everyone is gender binary. And, I've told everyone I've consulted those things as well.
Thank you. I think that's one of the main issues I have, certainly in education, is the number of times people still might, after a 2-hour, training, say, oh, but are they gay? Like, goodness, they didn't get that was different right from the beginning. How many more times do people have to hear it before that penny drops? So when you think about Soldier's Girl, Trans America, Dallas Buyers Club, and the role you're working on currently with an actress playing a trans lawyer, and perhaps others, do you think there's an improvement in the directors and cast's understanding?
It's definitely getting better. Right now, the show Transparent, which you can watch on Amazon.com in the US, I'm not sure if it's playing here yet, but Jill Soloway is the creator, the writer, and the director of this show. Jill's parent transitioned to female, and the series is very inspired by that. Again, it has a cisgender male playing the role, sort of inspired by her parent who transitioned from male to female. But although she did cast a major actor, a major cisgender male actor in that lead role, she very quickly felt the pushback from the trans community, very quickly educated herself, and she has since cast a large number of trans actors and actresses in supporting roles. She's hired a trans woman to join the writer's staff. She's hired trans people even on the crew, like who, you know, carrying cable and running cameras and stuff. And this show, though it started out a bit less than perfect, has now become, it must be, the most trans-inclusive set in Hollywood. And it's really setting the standard because it's getting a lot of positive feedback, a lot of media coverage. And everybody else in Hollywood, however they feel inside, they're like, oh, I got to get that award too. I got to get that coverage too. So I think they're going to get on board with that.
Oh, that's magnificent. So there's many more people involved from the trans community in all aspects, is what you're saying.
Oh, yeah, on the set of Transparent alone, I mean, Google it. There's, I keep saying Google it, but there's, it's a game changer, and it's just going to keep going from there, I think.
Yeah, and I personally got the opportunity to see Transparent, and I thought that was a really wonderfully respectful portrayal of the situation. So look, we're going to move on now. Another person who was also shunted into the public view was Aram Hosie.
Our next guest is LGBTI activist, advocate, educator, and writer Aram Hosie. Aram has played an integral role in the development of passport policies for trans and intersex applicants, as well as government guidelines on the recognition of sex and gender and changes to Medicare policy. He currently advocates for trans people's health and rights globally via the MSM Global Forum's International Reference Group and chairs Australia's National LGBTI Health Alliance's Intersex, Transgender and Gender Diverse Working Group. Please welcome to the stage Aram Hosie.
Welcome, Aram.
Thank you.
You've also served on numerous boards, on Pride WA, the same-sex domestic abuse, the welfare rights advocacy, and on the Western Australia Gender Project. You were also the recipient of the 2008 World AIDS Day Youth Award. And you were a keynote speaker last year at the 2014 Isabel Lake Memorial Lecture. Now, you also experienced involuntary exposure due to your relationship with Green Senator Louise Pratt. How was it for you to be cast in that spotlight? And were you all at all prepared for that visibility?
So the very first thing I need to say is it was Labor Senator Louise Pratt, or I'm going to be in massive trouble.
Thank you.
Was I prepared? Not at all. I guess I had no choice about being visible in my transition because I was with a public figure, and so it was incredibly obvious when that public figure's partner transitioned from being female to male. So as you do when you're involved even remotely around the edges with politics, you prepare for the eventualities, and we assume there would be media interest, and there was. And I guess much like your experience, kind of I was hounded by all kinds of journalists wanting to write stories, and it was an exercise in trying to find one that would write a good story, and also absolutely in that kind of harm minimisation approach. So in the end, the journalist that wrote the story was probably not great, but we got kind of corralled into needing to do the story. It was, again, they were going to do it kind of with or without us. They grabbed photos, they were going to do it. So I ended up participating in that story. Ended up on page 3 of the state's newspaper, so was not expecting a massive photo of myself on page 3 of the paper. The experience of walking into a cafe to get a coffee that Saturday morning and seeing people do that as I walked in was quite shocking. So I wasn't really prepared for it. But the ultimate outcome of it, in terms of people's response to that article, was made it worth it, even though it was difficult as a process.
Wow. And I guess from what you're saying, that you're kind of expecting it, so had yourself psychologically prepared for whatever that was going to entail.
Yeah, to the best that you can. I think until you start playing with the media, you don't quite know what you're in for. So yeah, it was as prepared as possible, I think.
So reflecting on the situation for transgender people when you transitioned around 7 or 8 years ago, compared to how it is now in Australia, what would you say is different?
It's very, very different. I think one of the things that I hadn't prepared for when I transitioned was the fact that even as a lesbian, I would have more rights than I would as a trans man post-transition. So whereas I had control of my own identity, I could access the medical services that I needed, I had discrimination protection. Once I transitioned to being a trans man, I gained male privilege and lost all of those other rights. So when I think about the situation now, it's much, much better. So the ability to access documentation that reflects my lived identity is easier. It's not perfect, but it's better. At a federal level, there's anti-discrimination protection for trans people. Medicare sorted out a lot of issues, passports have sorted out a lot of issues, and the visibility around trans folk in media and just more broadly, even through events like this, has really changed. I certainly was the only visible trans person in WA at the time that I ended up in the newspaper. Now I most certainly am not, and that's fantastic. It's great that's great.
And you mentioned the anti-discrimination legislation. I guess I want to ask you, do you feel that sometimes that's a kind of lip service, or do you feel that it is enacted in the best interests of transgender people? There's a way to go. I mean, one of the issues, certainly at a federal level, obviously, is the wording is really good around the inclusion of both transgender and intersex people, but there's still religious exemptions. And so often the places where you do encounter discrimination is around access to services that religious organisations provide on behalf of the Commonwealth Government. So accessing things like healthcare, like housing services, welfare services, they're provided by religious organisations. So whilst we have these protections in law, when it comes to then the reality of whether they make a difference in day-to-day life, there can be some limits to that. And certainly in my home state, in Western Australia, the law there is pretty bad, to be honest. So it's framed around using the language of gender history. And so that assumes that you have to have completed your transition and have legally changed your identity. So if you haven't been able to legally change your identity, if you're in the process of transition, then you're not protected under anti-discrimination law in WA. And I still find it astounding that in 2015, the majority of trans people living in WA can be legally discriminated against. And even in this situation where the legislation does apply, what I notice is that the transgender community as a whole has been so oppressed that when something does go wrong, someone does lose their job, or they've been attacked or discriminated against in some way, they don't enact the legislation to protect themselves or to have their rights respected.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been, like I said, changes to Medicare, passports, anti-discrimination law, but the extent to which those changes have been widely communicated to people, I think, is not great. And then if you've experienced discrimination, and often that process can be highly traumatic, it's not an easy process to then take a complaint and go through all of those steps that you have to do to resolve that. So for many folks, it's kind of preferable for them to go and heal after whatever's happened and try and move on from that, rather than reliving and working through it over and over.
And also, there's a kind of reshaming process that often goes on for transgender people where they lose any confidence they might have had to actually speak up.
Yeah, it's not an empowering process. If I reflect on the different things I've done, I've been through arbitration processes through the Human Rights Commission, I've been through legal cases. You get cross-examined, you hear the other side restating their things, and it is not a fun experience to be talking about your genitals with a room full of strangers, or hearing the arguments around why you're not really a man, or why all of those things. So the process can be quite disempowering.
Yeah, and punishing. I just want to ask Calpurnia, is that true in the States too, Calpurnia, that even though there are some places where protection is afforded for transgender people, that it's often not actually enacted because of the oppression?
There are so many places. The Human Rights Campaign Commission, the HRC in the U.S., fought hard to get employment non-discrimination, et cetera, but they did not include trans people in their fight for the legislation. So there are so many places where we can be fired or refused, even refused a place to live just because we're trans. It's a very patchy quilt of coverage.
And I guess the problem is that state by state it's different there and also here. Yeah. So, Aram, you're currently advocating for trans people's health and rights globally through the MSM Global Forum's International Reference Group for Transgender People.
It's quite a mouthful, isn't it?
It is. I had to practice that a few times. Can you explain to us the role of this global forum and how through advocacy you hope to make a difference for trans people's health and rights?
Sure. So I guess in terms of the role, the MSMGF, so it's the Global Forum on Men Who Have Sex with Men and HIV, and there's pleasingly growing recognition of the fact that globally transgender people bear a disproportionate burden when it comes to contracting HIV. And typically they've been largely overlooked in the response. The focus, quite rightly, very often has been on men who have sex with men, and then other vulnerable groups. But actually, of the small amount of evidence that's available, trans people, particularly in certain parts of the world, Washington DC is one of them, experience extraordinarily high rates of HIV transmission. And then couple that with all of those problems you have around medical access, then it often means that not only are trans people at risk of infection, but they often progress to full-blown AIDS and die prematurely. So there is a real need to address this globally, and the Global Forum, to its credit, has tried to see what they can do to auspice and to grow and enable trans people themselves to start advocating for those issues. So that's I guess the HIV reason for it. But more broadly, if there's a good thing that can be said about, I guess, HIV and the fight against HIV, it's that in order to address what leads to HIV prevention, you have to address the laws, the stigma, the other issues that put people at risk. So, for example, in countries where being gay or being transgender criminalises you, people are forced into really unsafe practices. They're really marginalised from society, and then that puts them at risk. And so it enables you to have conversations about rights, about legal protections, about dignity for people, about removing stigma using the hook of HIV. So it's something that Michelle Sidibe, the head of UNAIDS, really talks about, that the beauty of the HIV movement is the opportunity to galvanise a conversation more broadly about human rights and about legal protection. So that's very much where a lot of the movement is at the moment in terms of trans people and HIV globally. And I guess we're really fortunate here in Australia. Our AIDS response has been fantastic. And so my involvement globally is looking at what can I do from a place of relative privilege to help that effort kind of abroad.
Thank you for that. And I remember that certainly some of the funding for transgender people came, through the network of HIV funding initially. So they've been very generous in that inclusive.
And it still does. There's a range of global studies that have been done which look at funding to the LGBTI movement. Very, very little funding goes to trans organisations doing trans work. Most of the money that goes to trans work goes via LGB organisations. So it's good that some money comes that way, but there's clearly still a way to go to support trans people to advocate for themselves.
And so, given that you became, I guess, publicly outed in being with Louise, and that you're doing this advocacy work, do you think that it would have been possible without that visibility as a trans person to actually make those differences and do that advocacy?
I think it would have been harder. I think a lot of the work that I've been involved in that's been successful in leading to policy change is actually kind of behind closed doors stuff. Okay. It's conversations with politicians and bureaucrats and working with them to craft something and to work it through. But I don't think that attention to the need to do reform would be as strong if there hadn't been visibility around trans people from myself and others. And certainly by virtue of being in the media, it means people Google me because they know that I'm a trans guy and come to me with all manner of interesting questions about the world or laws, and that, so it does open up some opportunity for conversation, and the opportunity then for me to refer people to other trans and intersex activists, or to pull people together to work on making a thing happen.
Thank you. So Calpurnia, when I think about your situation of being in the spotlight compared to Aram, the settings were so extraordinarily in contrast. You were in absolute anguish and grieving, and Aram was celebrating his relationship with Louise. So as you're listening to all this, I was wondering, did you see any similarities in your experience of being suddenly visible to the public?
Well, I guess the parallel is just that, you know, in both circumstances, I can only assume that we're both very involved in an important personal situation, you know, a personal moment that is perhaps not particularly engineered to have the eyes of the world on it, and it puts so much pressure on things. I know in my own circumstance, I was very early in my transition. Barry was a very young man who had never dated a trans person before, and to suddenly have all this judgment on, you know, when I wasn't ready, I didn't feel like I had gotten myself together. I wanted to honor his love for me as well. I wanted to live up to and be a woman that he could be proud of, you know, and he would have been, even, you know, though I was new, but it just felt as though someone had yanked aside the curtain on some very personal moment and thrown the cold, judgmental eyes of the world on it. It was very hard.
And so terribly unfair that you didn't have any say in that.
I never sought out the media. I never wanted it, and if there was anything I could ever have done to make that not happen, of course, it goes without saying, you know.
Yeah. So Aram, I remember reading recently that you were being referred to as Louise's lesbian partner. It seems to me that there is still some very strong stereotyping. For example, even in Orange is the New Black, that there is some positivity in the character Sophia. She is still cast, though, as camp, obsessed with hair, nails and appearance. I'm interested in both your opinions on where you feel the media is at regarding the representation of trans people.
Well, I always caution people, you know, don't look to the media don't look to movies and television for, you know, the sort of portrayal of record. Entertainment is entertainment. It's always going to be extreme. It's always going to be fantasy. It's always going to be silly and imperfect. It's a great tool, and it's one to which I've dedicated my life to using, but you know, find your heroes in real life, like right here is a hero. You know, don't turn on your television.
I think that's very sweet. Thank you. I think the media's gotten, I'm reflecting just in Australia, I think it's gotten marginally better. That first article in the West Australian, I was the senator's sex swap partner, which was not my ideal language. I've learned that you can manage journalists, but then it gets to the editors and the sub-editors who write the titles and the bylines, and you have no control over that. And they tend to get really excited, and they don't have a relationship with you, and all kinds of weird things come out. So when I went back and had a look at that article, actually given tonight, and the language in there was interesting, and the things they focused on about the fact that I didn't like wearing dresses when I grew up was it's this very basic and very simplistic kind of thing. I find now the conversations have largely moved on, and we can have more sophisticated and interesting conversations about rights. So I think it's better, but there's still clearly room for improvement. See previous example in Queensland when they were still talking about that trans woman who was murdered and calling her a she-male on the front of the paper. So it's better, but it's not there yet. But I just think, you know, to borrow your phrase, all of those imperfect steps along the way help get us down the road. And it's about finding good journalists, good people that you can work with, doing the education over and over and over again, as much as that can be tiring, because it's not a perfect source of information, but it can be a tool, and that visibility I think is important.
Thank you. So look, I want to thank you both for this stimulating conversation, and look, we're going to continue. So look, don't go away. Firstly, we're going to put our hands together for Calpurnia and Aram.